The desert sun glared like a cruel god over Fort Canyon, a white-hot eye that showed no mercy to man or beast. Dust swirled around the open yard, kicked up by soldiers' boots as they gathered in grim silence. The air shimmered with heat, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out before diving back into the endless blue. At the center of the yard stood a wooden post, sun-bleached and scarred from years of punishment. Bound to it by leather straps was a man, bare-chested, shoulders squared, his long black hair whipping in the wind. His skin gleamed with sweat, his back a canvas of old scars that told of battles survived and pain endured. He was Apache, and his name was Taji. The soldiers had heard the whispers before he arrived. Some said he was a spirit, others that he was a fool. A few, quieter and more superstitious, claimed he had walked willingly into the jaws of death to deliver a warning. Now, standing under the gaze of the entire fort, he looked less like a prisoner and more like a storm made flesh. Sergeant Kellen, a broad-shouldered man with a thick jaw and a cruel temper, stood before him, whip coiled loosely in one hand. His eyes glinted with something between anger and disbelief. "You could save yourself a world of pain, Apache," he said, voice roughened by years of whiskey and war. "Just tell us where your people hide. Tell us where that canyon is, and I might even let you walk out of here." Taji didn't move. His head lifted slightly, and his dark eyes met Kellen's without a flicker of fear. "You want the canyon?" he said slowly, his English heavy but clear. "Then go find it yourself. The land doesn't hide from men like you. It waits." The sergeant's nostrils flared. The soldiers behind him shuffled, uncertain whether to be impressed or alarmed. They weren't used to this kind of defiance, especially not from someone with his hands tied. Kellen stepped closer, his voice dropping low. "You crossed into our land. You stole one of our horses. You rode straight into this fort with a warning like you owned the place. You should be begging for mercy." Taji's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Mercy is for those who fear death." The words landed like a slap. The sergeant spat into the dirt and raised the whip. "Let's see how brave you sound after 10 lashes." The first strike tore through the silence like thunder. The sound of leather meeting flesh echoed off the walls, sharp and merciless. Taji's body jerked once, his jaw tightening, but no sound escaped him. Blood welled up and trickled down his spine, glinting dark red under the sun. The soldiers looked on, some grim, others fascinated. The young private at the end of the line turned his face away. "This isn't right," he muttered. But no one spoke up. A second lash, then a third, each one harder, more desperate, as if Kellen wanted to break not just the body but the spirit. Taji's breathing grew ragged, yet his eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. He thought of his tribe, the elders who had sent him, the children who played near the canyon stream, his sister's laughter. If he spoke, they would find the sacred place. They would desecrate it as they had done to so many others. Somewhere at the edge of the yard, a soft gasp broke through the heavy air. Lydia, the doctor's daughter, stood in the doorway of the infirmary, her hand over her mouth. She had seen men torn apart by bullets, but there was something different in the way this man endured the pain, something that reached beyond flesh. She wanted to turn away, but she couldn't. After the 6th lash, the sergeant's arm trembled, sweat dripped from his brow, and his breath came heavy. "Say it," he barked. "Say yes, and it's over." Taji's head tilted slightly. His lips parted, and for a moment it seemed he might yield, but instead his voice came out low, rough, and unwavering. "Let them whip me," he said. "I still won't say yes." The word stopped Kellen mid-motion. The whip hung in the air for a heartbeat before dropping limp at his side. The silence that followed was louder than any cry could have been. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Taji stood there bleeding, swaying slightly but unbroken. His chest rose and fell, each breath a declaration of defiance. The sergeant turned away, muttering curses under his breath. The soldiers dispersed, leaving only the sound of chains creaking and the desert wind whistling through the fort. Lydia lingered, hidden in the shadow of the doorway. Her eyes glistened with something she didn't yet understand. Respect, sorrow, maybe even awe. The Apache had refused to yield, even when the world demanded it. As the sun sank lower, the light softened, casting long shadows across the yard. Taji's blood glowed dark against the dust, but his spirit burned brighter than the dying day. The fort thought it had captured a man. It hadn't. It had chained the wind itself, and the wind would not stay still for long. Night draped itself over Fort Canyon like a heavy shroud, and the day's heat finally gave way to a biting chill that crept through the walls. The moon hung low, pale and watchful, casting silver light across the courtyard where hours earlier the Apache had stood bound and bleeding. The soldiers had long since retired to the barracks, the echo of their laughter fading behind closed doors. But one room in the fort still stirred with quiet unrest. Inside the small infirmary, Lydia sat by the window, the faint glow of her lantern trembling with every breath she took. Her hands were still stained faintly with blood from the men she had treated earlier, but that wasn't what kept her awake. It was him, the Apache, Taji. She could still see the way his back had opened beneath the whip, the way he'd refused to cry out, the fire in his eyes even as blood streaked his skin. Her father, Dr. Weston, had left her strict orders. Do not go near the prisoner. He's dangerous. But Lydia's thoughts had refused to obey. Dangerous, her father had said, but dangerous to whom? The man had stood in silence as they tore into him. His body the only thing he had left to offer in defiance, and for that they called him savage. When the fort's clock struck midnight, Lydia rose. She moved quietly, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, then gathered a bowl of water, clean cloth, and a small tin of salve. Her hands trembled as she pushed open the infirmary door, stepping into the cold night. The moonlight brushed her face pale as she crossed the yard, her boots barely crunching the dirt. Every few steps she paused, listening. Only the distant snoring of soldiers and the low hum of the desert wind answered. The storeroom where they kept Taji was a small wooden shed near the stables, guarded by shadows more than men. The key weighed heavy in her pocket, her father's borrowed without his knowing. When she reached the door, she hesitated for a heartbeat, her pulse hammering. Then she slipped the key into the lock and turned it with a soft click. The door creaked open. He was there, seated on the ground, his back to the wall, wrists bound with iron cuffs that caught the lantern light. His head was bowed, but his eyes flickered open as she stepped inside. Even in the dim glow, his gaze was sharp and clear. You shouldn't be here, he said, voice rough as gravel, though not unkind. I know, she whispered, closing the door behind her. If they find me, I'll lose more than my father's trust. He tilted his head, a faint trace of amusement crossing his face. Then why risk it? She knelt beside him, setting the lantern down. Because they shouldn't have done this to you. Because no one should suffer like that for refusing to betray their people. She dipped the cloth into the water and began cleaning the wounds along his back. The gashes were deep, still raw from the day's beating. He flinched once, barely. You could have lied, she said after a moment. Said anything to make it stop. And then what? His voice grew firmer. They would find the canyon and your people would build their roads, their mines, their graves over my ancestors. Pain ends, dishonor does not. Lydia swallowed, her throat tight. You talk as if there's honor in dying for dirt. Not dirt, he said, turning his head slightly toward her. The land is the breath of my people. When it dies, we die too. The room fell silent again. Lydia worked carefully, her hands steady now. The salve stung as it touched the open flesh, but he didn't complain. Instead, his eyes drifted to her face, studying her, this young woman with trembling courage who had stepped into his cage. Why do you care, white woman? He asked softly. She met his gaze, startled by the question. Because I saw a man today, she said. Not a savage, not an enemy, a man who refused to break. I don't know what that means to you, but to me, it means something worth saving. Something flickered in his eyes, something unspoken, fragile, but real. When she finished, she reached into her pocket and drew out the key again. It glinted faintly in the lamplight. For a long moment, she just held it between them, the weight of what she was about to do pressing down on her like the night itself. If I free you, she whispered, they'll call me a traitor. He met her gaze with quiet certainty. If you don't, you'll remember this forever. Her hand trembled as she unlocked the cuffs. The iron fell away with a dull clang that seemed louder than thunder. He stood slowly, wincing as his muscles strained against the pain. You should go now, she urged, her voice barely above a breath. There's a gate near the well, it's not guarded. Taji nodded, then paused by the doorway. You crossed a line tonight, he said. Your own kind will not forgive that easily. She swallowed hard. Maybe some lines deserve to be crossed.